Hello and welcome to the Data Engineering Podcast, the show about modern data management. What are the pieces of advice that you wish you had received early in your career of data engineering? If you hand a book to a new data engineer, what wisdom would you add to it? I'm working with O'Reilly on a project to collect the 97 things that every data engineer should know, and I need your help. Go to dataengineeringpodcast.com/97things to add your voice and share your hard-earned expertise. And when you're ready to build your next pipeline or want to test out the projects you hear about on the show, you'll need somewhere to deploy it, so check out our friends over at Linode. With their managed Kubernetes platform, it's now even easier to deploy and scale your workflows or try out the latest Helm charts from tools like Pulsar, Pachyderm, and Dagster. With simple pricing, fast networking, object storage, and worldwide data centers, you've got everything you need to run a bulletproof data platform. Go to dataengineeringpodcast.com/Linode, that's Linode, today and get a $60 credit to try out a Kubernetes cluster of your own. And don't forget to thank them for their continued support of this show. If you've been exploring scalable, cost-effective, and secure ways to collect and route data across your organization, RudderStack is the only solution that helps turn your own warehouse into a state-of-the-art customer data platform. Their mission is to empower data engineers to fully own their customer data infrastructure and easily push value to other parts of the organization, like marketing and product management. With their open-source foundation, fixed pricing, and unlimited volume, they are enterprise-ready but accessible to everyone. Go to dataengineeringpodcast.com/rudder today to request a demo and get 1 free month of access to the hosted platform along with a free t-shirt. Your host is Tobias Macy, and today I'm interviewing Pardew Gunam and Mars Lan about DataHub, LinkedIn's metadata management and data catalog platform. So Mars, can you start by introducing yourself?
Hello, I'm Mars. I'm the tech lead for the metadata team at LinkedIn. I joined LinkedIn about 3.5 years ago to lead this fledgling metadata team back then. This was kind of actually my first dabble in the data world. Prior to that, I was mostly working in cloud infra related project. But I do believe that coming from a different background actually sort of bring new ideas to this area. And I was able to, so I believe that coming from a different background helps to bring new perspective into this area. And I certainly hope that DataHub will be the proof of that.
And Pardew, how about you?
Pardew Gunam from DataHub team. I am the engineering manager on this team for the last couple of years. So in my first 4 years at LinkedIn, I worked on various data analytics platforms and projects. On various occasions, I really felt a necessity for a good connected metadata story to solve a lot of the data problems holistically across systems. Then I started working on tracking systems, operational tracking system, and eventually saw the whole big picture around the metadata and moved to the metadata team at LinkedIn. Having the customer perspective of the requirement of such a metadata system definitely helps me to understand the key pain points which DataHub needs to solve for its users.
And Mars, you mentioned that you hadn't had much experience in the data space before working on DataHub, but do you remember how you first got introduced to data management there and a little bit of the experience of getting started with it?
Sure. I mean, it's not like I have zero experience with data, but data at Google is very different from data outside of Google. So I mean, I did work on some, simple sort of MapReduce or Flume as, the popular framework adopted at Google. So for data processing and whatnot, but certainly not in the analytical world, certainly not doing all these fancy queries and that sort of stuff, dashboarding and all that. But I do feel like coming in here, it's fairly easy to relate because, even though I work in the infra area, it is still technically big data we're working with, except it's mostly sort of online data with databases and whatnot. So it's not like a complete foreign territory. But I think it definitely, joining LinkedIn and joining the data team, open up a new world to me where I see how, actually these data can be used in all sorts of different ways offline and then being able to produce magical results there.
And Pardew, do you remember how you first got involved in data management?
Yeah, like I said, I was working on one of the projects to trace operational issues for a lot of metrics which are computed on a platform called Unified Metrics Platform at LinkedIn. And a lot of these issues are actually related to the connectedness between across systems, and it's never the problem within one system. So that problem, that single project got me hooked into a lot of metadata related projects and interested in this particular team, which is solely focused on solving the data management using metadata.
And so you mentioned that you're working on metadata management, you're using DataHub, but can you give a bit more of an overview about what the DataHub project is and some of its backstory?
Sure. So we published this engineering blog post on LinkedIn's engineering blog site about a year ago. So the title of the blog is called DataHub Generalized Metadata Search and Discovery Tool. And it actually has a pretty decent sections on the backstory. And then it's actually quite an interesting backstory. I'll definitely encourage your listener to go and read the full blog. But, just in short, DataHub is kind of a V3 version of our attempt to do metadata solutions at LinkedIn. And, it's kind of incorporating all the learning that we have from the previous attempts and hoping we do believe that it is a much better product compared to its predecessor. So yeah, definitely I'll encourage the listener to find out more details in that blog post.
And you mentioned that this is the third iteration of metadata management at LinkedIn. I'm curious, what were some of the challenges that you were facing in terms of data discovery and metadata management prior to building the current incarnation of DataHub, and what was lacking in some of the previous solutions that motivated you to rethink and redesign the overall platform?
Sure. So the sort of whole metadata management started from LinkedIn with a project called Warehouse. This is probably I would say probably 5 years ago when the project was first started, and actually it also got open source. And prior to that, there's actually no such thing exists inside of LinkedIn. That was actually the first of its kind. I honestly don't know. This is prior to my tenure at LinkedIn. I honestly have no idea how people get the job done before then in terms of doing search and discovery, because there's no tools to support that at all. So Warehouse was definitely one of the first attempts that we try at LinkedIn, and it was kind of a natural way that you will approach this problem. And in fact, we do actually see a lot of project out there that is still following this path, right? Which is focus a lot on crawling different sources, getting metadata into one place, and then have a sort of a search backend that allows you to do a Google style search around these metadata. And that's definitely the correct thing to do, in my opinion. If you don't have anything at all, that would definitely be a V1. But we've evolved so much since then. Once again, the blog post will talk about the exact reason why we went through different phases of evolution. But with DataHub, what we have right now is kind of what we would view as a complete solution. It's not a solution that's just trying to address the search and discovery problem, or just trying to address the operational metadata problem and whatnot. It's kind of a full solution that capable of addressing all these problems. And even inside of LinkedIn, we're just sort of only scratching the surface right now of the capability of these tools, this tools.
In terms of the overall problem space of data discovery and tracking metadata, what have you found to be some of the most difficult aspects of it, and some of the elements of DataHub that have been most helpful for the end users?
So there's two challenges, right? One is on the consumer side, which is like data scientists, data engineers, AI engineers. They want to consume these metadata in sort of as efficient as possible way, right? Quickly find the stuff that they want, quickly figure out if this is the thing that they need, and quickly figure out how things are related, so on and so forth. So a lot of that sort of boils down to more or less UI challenges, assuming that you have all the metadata. It's about how do you present those information back to the user in a useful way. So then that's a constant challenge from our perspective as well, where we are working closely with UX designer and our customer to make sure that we're presenting information in the way that's most helpful to the users. But I think there's also, on the flip side, is also the sort of gathering or producing, if you will, these metadata in the first place. And that in and of itself can be viewed as an infra problem, because you want to have a proper infrastructure that's able to ingest all sorts of different metadata from all sorts of different places in a very scalable way. And then I think that is a hard problem, because if you don't have that solid foundation, it's very hard to build useful things on top. And I think that's definitely one of the DataHub's differentiator, in our opinion, where we do believe that we have a very strong infrastructure and we create something that's general enough that can be used to present sort of pretty much any sort of metadata you want to throw at it without having to re-architect the whole thing every time.
Metadata management and data catalogs are a concept that have been around for a while in different forms and for different generations of data platforms, and they also range between open source and proprietary. I'm curious, what was missing in some of those existing solutions that put you down the path of building something internally? I don't know if it was something that's specific to the data platforms that are being used at LinkedIn or the ways that you're processing the information, or if it's just a generational thing where the previously available data catalogs and metadata platforms just didn't suit the needs of what the current set of tooling and the overall ecosystem requires.
I think I can definitely talk about why we choose an open source solution or a homegrown solution over a proprietary one, but we might need an entire podcast for that. But it's sufficient to say that it's not very uncommon for companies who want to capture highly customized metadata or to integrate with their in-house solutions, right? So having access to the source code is almost a must in those cases. And also, what we heard fairly commonly from our open source customers is that a lot of time they don't want to lock themselves into some sort of proprietary solution, right? It doesn't matter how great a solution is. I think it's kind of a general trend in the industry where people are more wary about locking themselves into a proprietary solution that they can't get out. So I would say open source is, in my opinion, is definitely the way to go, especially for something that's so going to be widely integrated within the organization. Not having open source is almost, in my opinion, not a acceptable solution. In that case, I wouldn't dig into what are the available proprietary solutions out there because there are quite a few of them out there, but I don't think it's an apple-to-apple comparison in that case. So on the open source front, to be honest, there's actually only a handful of projects in this area if you search. And then, we'd like to believe that we are the leading project in this area. And, the some of the stuff that we hear from our customers that why they choose DataHub, including things like, the architecture is super flexible and extensible. And then also, the fact that this system has been battle tested at LinkedIn scale. And also, this is the only system that is stream first when it comes to metadata ingestion. In fact, the whole stream, or Kafka, to be more precise, integration is throughout the system. And then it also builds on top of, kind of a more modern big data architecture where pretty much everything can scale up and down the stack. And, I think also, most importantly, a lot of people told us that we have an awesome team and very responsive team behind the project. And that's the reason why they choose us, because they believe that we will keep driving the project in a direction that will, improve in terms of features and whatnot, and then fit their need if it doesn't fit the need today. So that's kind of it. Yeah.
And as far as the end users of DataHub, who is the target audience, and how has that particular focus helped to direct the features and the design of the DataHub platform?
We have identified we have categorized the audience for DataHub into 4 categories, into 4 major personas. The first one is data producers and data consumers who interact with the data on a regular basis. The second one is the data operators who need to understand the data flow and health of the pipelines that process or move this data for these data consumers and producers. The third one is an interesting persona from the organizational leaders, all the way from CISOs or CDOs to engineering managers who are interested in getting the bigger picture of the data ecosystem with respect to privacy or usage or how the data flows within their org or team. The fourth one is DataHub goal is beyond being just a data catalog. It truly acts as a centralized metadata store for other data systems as well, to operate their data ecosystem better. It acts as a source of metadata for all these systems to interact with other systems. These are the primary target audience for DataHub in today's world. Talking to you about your second thing of how does this end users influence? If you really look at it, the true goal of DataHub is to democratize the data management. It is important for us to build the right metadata foundations, which are very generic and extendable and integrate well with any of these systems. Our actual end users and these above personas, which I talked about, and the use cases what they come up with definitely influence our roadmap heavily. So if you really look at it, we are bringing a very new approach of doing metadata around existing data ecosystems. So it is very important for us to be guided by the impact of the solutions we build to really solve these day-to-day data user problems.
And you mentioned that DataHub is used as a metadata catalog for other components in the ecosystem. I know that there are things like the Hive Metastore that act as a source of information for table structures for things like data lakes using S3 or HDFS. I'm wondering if DataHub is also able to provide that same level of capability.
So yes, I think we pride ourselves as being a generalized metadata store or services. So that is certainly possible. But I think Hive Metastore is a special case in the sense that unless you have a drop-in replacement for it, it has a deep integration with a lot of big data tools out there. So even if you have a comparable service or even better service for that matter, it's very hard to replace Hive Metastore in an instance. So I don't think that's our goal to replace Hive Metastore. I do think Hive Metastore is definitely a super important player in the ecosystem. But to gather those metadata into our services so we can link that up to other things that Hive Metastore wouldn't have access to. I think that's the role, one of the critical role DataHub and its system plays. Because every system will obviously excels in what they do. Every metadata service in different ecosystem, they will definitely be extremely good at what they're doing. But very few of them will have any interest in linking up their stuff with somebody else's stuff because that's just not part of their charter. And I think this is where DataHub will come in and say, yes, we will be that player where we will gather these metadata from other places. And for the cases where there isn't a metadata service, DataHub has certainly been used as that. And in fact, inside of LinkedIn, there are multiple cases where we're creating a brand new metadata service. And then DataHub was the de facto choice in that case, right? They were just created on top of the same architecture that we build on top and automatically get those integrations.
And can you dig a bit more into the architecture of DataHub and how it's designed and some of the ways that you're able to actually integrate the metadata into the catalog? Because I know that it's a push-based versus a pull-based. So I don't know if you wanted to dig into that a little bit as well.
Most certainly. So instead of going into like the weeds about how each little things was implemented, I'll stay a little bit high level here and talk about the principle of our architecture, because the details could change over time. We know that, but the principle hopefully won't. So there's three principles that we build DataHub on top of. So the first one, like you mentioned, string-based. So everything, all the ingestion, all that happens should happen through a push. So for a system that doesn't have capability to push, you can still write a crawler to crawl the system, but then push out those things through Kafka. So the actual ingestion, the main way of ingesting is through Kafka stream. So the benefit of doing that is, hopefully all your listener would be able to relate almost immediately, because Kafka is not something new here. But first of all, it allows incremental ingestion, right? So you can, whenever something changes, only at that instance do you actually push out the change. Of course, that's a lot more efficient than trying to do a snapshot every day or every hours for that matter. And of course, also there's the near real-time benefits as well, right? When something change, some metadata change, you get notified immediately and take action if you want to. So not just the ingestion part of it, actually we take this to the extreme, right? In fact, any metadata that get gathered or directly authored on DataHub will also have a change stream coming out of it, right? So there is actually you can imagine a standardized metadata CDC stream coming out of DataHub, where you can then build application that's trigger based on top. In fact, we do that extensively inside of LinkedIn as well, where we have system basically just listen to these, metadata changes and then take action based off that. So, and then because of this, stream-based approach, the architecture becomes very, very scalable, because now it becomes a problem now, how do you scale Kafka? And then that problem, more or less is considered solved at a certain scale, right? So that's the first principle, which is stream-based. The second principle is extensibility, right? So we want a system to be very, very extendable in all sorts of different aspects. And that's why we started off with a generalized data model, right? So we say, hey, look, we know metadata is going to be, sure, there will be common things across, everybody will sort of depends on, but there's also very specific things that people want to do just for their organizations. So the metadata model has to be completely generalized and extendable. So because of that, we allow users to easily unpull new type of metadata, regardless of their complexity. And we often joke about that. When do we know that we are successful? Is when people spend 90% of their time debating on how to model metadata correctly, and then spend 10% of the time doing the actual coding. Then we know we're successful. So In fact, because of this, extensible and generalized model, we are actually able to onboard more than 500 different kinds of metadata inside of LinkedIn, right? For over 50 different kind of entity within a matter of 18 months. That's completely unheard of inside of LinkedIn, right? Any sort of platform, the sort of normal speed of onboarding things is you're talking about order of months, not order of days. And we were able to really, really reduce that because we have a very generalized and extendable architecture. And so that's the second point, which is extensibility. And then the third point is decentralization. So we realized that most tech company nowadays they run microservices, right? Or even serverless for the even more advanced companies. And it seems pretty backward to say, hey, because metadata, we have to run it in a monolithic service, operate by a single team. That just seems very backward. But in fact, that's how most systems are built, metadata systems are built, because they automatically assume because we need to gather data in one place, so of course, it has to be one single centralized giant service. But DataHub is designed from the ground up to support decentralized metadata service. And in fact, that's how we run this inside of LinkedIn, right? We actually have 20 plus different metadata service that's part of the DataHub ecosystem that all sort of in charge of the different kind of metadata in that sense. But for simplicity, in the open source version, we just have a single service because that's how people most familiar with it, and we don't want to overcomplicate the story. But we just want to emphasize that the architecture is designed to be decentralized. It's not designed to be centralized.
And so does that mean that you can have multiple different instances of DataHub deployed across different environments, and then you're able to link them together to be able to do federated searches for data discovery?
So the detail is, once again, if you go to our GitHub repository or read a blog post, the detail will surface there. But I'll just summarize it here saying that we take a very micro service sort of way of doing things. So each service will have their own metadata. So they will become the source of truth for those metadata with a sort of a typical CRUD interface. But because we have these change stream system built into every services, so we are able to gather the change stream in a central place and then use that to build up search index and graph indexes. Right? Because of that, yes, the search index and graph index is still quote unquote considered centralized rather than federated, but that was more of a constraint of the system themselves because trying to do complete distributed graph and complete distributed search is a little bit harder. And then that's why we chose to have this approach. And the current system is very scalable, so that's considered acceptable in that sense.
And another element that you pointed out is the modeling of the metadata itself and being able to represent it effectively and discover it. So I'm curious what you have found to be some of the most useful ways of representing the metadata and any enforcement that you have in terms of defining a basic set of structures that are necessary for the records in the catalog to make them useful for the downstream consumers.
Yeah, you're touching on a very, very good point here. So there's multiple ways of attacking this problem. I think they generally fall into a couple of buckets. So one bucket is the sort of the lowest common denominator bucket where we basically say, okay, because there's so many things that are sort of heterogeneous, that's just take the most common thing across everybody and just say, hey, here's the model. It should work for all of you guys because it's the lowest common denominator, and then just move on with that, right? But of course, the problem with that approach is that you're gonna lose all these richness in metadata because now you abstract everything. So everything looks like a square hole, right? And you're trying to fit a round peg into it, so to speak. So that's one approach. The other approach is the other extreme where you say, okay, we're gonna treat everything as key value pair, right? Now then we can represent anything we want. So if everything just a key and a value, and the value can be arbitrarily complex if you want to, or can be mapped within the map within the map. Right? That approach, of course, is super generalized, and you can stick any kind of metadata you want in it. But then the consumer will hate you for that, right? Because now everything looks like a map, right? So all the logic of interpreting the map, or even try to validate that schema, will fall onto the consumer side. And then nobody will like that sort of interface because there's no guarantee on, whether this API will even maintain backward compatibility going forward. So that's the second bucket. So we're trying to strike a balance between the two extremes and then try to stay in the middle where we say, okay, we recognize that metadata itself is very hard to give a meaning to a specific structure to it, so to speak. It's like when someone asks you what's a typical structure for data, then you'll be scratching your head and say, well, I don't know. I mean, it can be anything. It can be any shape. So the same thing happens to metadata. We're not trying to pretend to know that, hey, metadata must have certain structure. But then we also want to put in some ground rules so that at least we make this thing useful for people. So first of all, we say, okay, we're gonna leverage a language that we developed at LinkedIn. It's called PDL. So at least we have strong schema associated with the metadata you want to capture. And then we also want to say, hey, we want to put in some ground rules that how you associate these metadata with one another, or even with the entity that they're supposed to be associated with. How do you do that hierarchy? How do you build graph on top? How do you do indexes and so on and so forth? So put in some sort of ground rule there, so at least things are able to be linked together. But when it comes to the thing, in terms of what goes into the metadata, we actually say you have complete freedom. You can put whatever you want in there. And that's actually the most powerful part of this. But we do recognize that there will be a subset of metadata that's, once again, sort of common that everybody will need and want. So the way we do it is we put out these common model, which we say, hey, look, we know these things are always going to be kind of true-ish for everybody. So, we don't want you to all come up with, 10 different ways of saying the same thing. Here are the common model. If you like it, use it. If you don't like it, develop your own or extend it to fit your need.
And in terms of actually populating the metadata, you mentioned that everything comes in through a Kafka stream, but I'm wondering if you can just talk through a bit more of the workflow of somebody who is publishing metadata about the data sets that they're collecting and curating, and then some of the ways that that metadata is used and represented at the other side for people to be able to discover useful data sets.
So a small correction. I didn't say that every ingestion comes through Kafka. I say majority of them comes through Kafka because for things that are sort of programmatic in nature, Kafka is the right way to go. But actually the service does provide sort of a REST API where you can have this strong guarantee, read after write consistency when you update something and you get result back immediately, right? So that actually exists as well. And then those are generally for sort of the more curated metadata, if you will, right? When someone type in a message description for a data set, or someone, set themselves as the owner of the data set. So almost like always when the human is involved, you kind of expect that, read after write consistency and then through a REST API. You don't expect you send the Kafka and then, wait for a few seconds and see that appear. That's just not natural for, especially when it comes to web app, right? It's kind of the expectation, if I change something, I expect to see it change immediately. So we have both avenue, and then they are sort of, dedicated for different purposes. Yeah, so that's kind of on the integration side. Sorry, what's the other question? Sorry, I think you were asking two questions.
And then the other question was on the other end where somebody is consuming the metadata to try and discover data sets or determine the health of a particular set of records or the relative popularity or utility of some data, how you're representing that on the user-facing side of it.
So on the consumer side, essentially, how do you consume the metadata? Once again, they are actually at least three different ways you can do it. There is, similar to the write path, there is the API path where you can call the REST API to get things. And we're actually working on a GraphQL-based API to make this even easier for everyone. So that is definitely there. And then I think that will be the majority of the cases that web app will be calling those API. And the nice thing about it is that your metadata was structured to start with. So your API was also structured. And they actually look exactly the same as your model. Everything is generated, so to speak, from the same model. So that way, you kind of exactly expect what to get in return from the API. So there's that. And then the second part is, I think I mentioned before, the Kafka stream, the change stream. These are more for near real time sort of, action-based triggers and not necessarily API web, but you think that, web can leverage that as well if they want to. So there's that. And then once again, whatever go onto that stream is exactly the same model that you define in the first place, metadata. So the consumer will actually there's no surprise from the consumer point of view. They don't have to transform the data further in order to map it into the expectation, because the expectation is what go in there in the first place. And then the third one, which is, probably less obvious, but because of the change stream that we have, we actually do stream that to offline and then create essentially a real, a delay version, but close to real-time version of the offline data set for the metadata. And this is geared obviously towards analytical use cases where people want to say, hey, I want to look at all the data set, all the dashboard that we have that happen to be, not used by anyone for the past 12 months and blah, 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 etc. So those are kind of the three ways to consume the metadata, if you will.
Yeah, just to add to that, the part of the question you asked also is about search relevance and the relevant data. How do you provide it to the consumers? There are certain aspects in our web app consumption where the search relevance is kind of there are provisions where the domain owners or the data producers can tune in the relevance for the particular data type. And there are also some work around some personalization based on what you have done or how you interact as a consumer with other data ecosystem. Those signals are taken in, like what team you belong and things like that, to provide like more personalized data discovery for you.
And then another element of metadata management is versioning of that information so that you can track when schema changes occur and then being able to ensure that the downstream consumers are using an appropriate version of that metadata for the point in time at which the source data was produced. So I'm wondering how you manage to store and represent the versioning of that metadata so that you can retain that information for the useful duration of its life cycle.
I'm glad you asked that, because that's once again what I believe that is one of the main differentiator of DataHub, because everything is versioned by default. In fact, we get complaint from people saying that you guys version too many things. Can I tune it down? And the answer is yes. You can choose how many versions you want to retain, or even do a time-based retention if you want to. One of the early design choice that we made was to make all the metadata immutable. So every change will result in the new version being captured. And this was kind of critical. I think the schema example you gave was a good example, but it is also when it comes to privacy and compliance related stuff that are human generated. Those things you do want to keep like a detailed track record of how the metadata was evolved, especially if the metadata is actually being used programmatically to make things happen. And if something breaks, you want to know why it breaks. And when someone provided the wrong metadata, you want to know why and when did that metadata went wrong. So all of that is out of the box. You get it out of the box. In fact, if you don't want it, you have to disable it manually. But so that being said, that's what we normally call internally automatic versioning, right? You don't need to explicitly tell people that, hey, I'm on version 1 or version 2. By virtue of me changing the metadata, there's a new version that's generated automatically. There is also explicit versioning where you say, look, I know my version. I'm on version XYZ for the schema or whatever. That is also supported through a different mechanism, but that requires a bit more thinking in terms of how you model it and all that. So I wouldn't get into the details of it. But I think the point is you get automatic versioning out of the box without doing anything at all.
And for somebody who's interested in deploying and maintaining an installation of DataHub, what's involved in getting it ready for production and the infrastructure considerations that they should be thinking about and the integration and extension points that they should be aware of for ensuring that it fits well into their deployed ecosystem? Sure.
So to simplify the deployment of DataHub, we have created Docker images in the open source where people will be able to just use it, whether they use it in sort of the raw Docker environment or they can use it in a Kubernetes environment if they want to. Actually, in fact, the community contributed Kubernetes and Helm chart support because we actually don't use that internally inside of LinkedIn, right? So we're not in the best position to provide that. And we're also planning to create examples on how you can deploy DataHub to popular cloud provider, Azure, AWS, GCP, and maybe even have some sort of one-click deployment option available where people can just click and do it. So I think on the deployment side, I think it's pretty standard and people should be able to just use it as they wish. In terms of integration, so there's actually quite a few components used inside our DataHub. Of course, there is, the sort of the app side, web app or backend and whatnot, but there's also storage, right? So in fact, we support, also different storages, sort of SQL-based storages if you want. So MySQL is kind of the default, but you can choose Maria or Postgres if you want. For storing the metadata, we're also working on the NoSQL equivalent, so you can store it on MongoDB if you want. So that's the storing of the raw metadata. but we also use a search as well as graph. And then this is yet once again the strengths of DataHub is when we design it, we make sure that we never marry ourselves to one specific technology. So we want to be able to say, hey, you can pick and choose whatever search engine you want, or you can pick and choose whatever graph DB you want, through higher level of abstraction. Even though now we have we use Elasticsearch as the default search engine, we use Neo4j as the default graph DB. We are working on making this even more generalized, so you can pretty much apply to any existing graph DB or existing search index that you have. That is not the default. So I think in terms of integrating that part, it will only get better if it's not already fitting 90% of the use cases out there.
And another interesting aspect of the work you're doing with DataHub is the way that you're managing the relationship between the internally deployed and internally used code that you're building at LinkedIn and the open source project, and some of the conflicts and challenges of trying to keep them both in sync. So I'm wondering if you can talk a bit more about the benefits and motivations for releasing DataHub as open source and some of the ways that you're approaching the ongoing maintenance of the internal and the public code.
Let me first talk about the motivations, like why DataHub was even chosen to be open source project, right? Like the answer to it lies really in history of some of the good projects which happened at LinkedIn. Definitely, LinkedIn has always been a champion of open source culture, and some of the popular projects like Kafka, Pinot, Goblin, and Samza has set good examples for us and to drive the motivation around open source. So being a data-driven company for LinkedIn, we definitely have learned and solved a lot of metadata-related problems at scale. We enjoy sharing our learnings and software with other companies. So as an industry, we don't get into this like reinvention of the same solutions around the common unmet needs around data or metadata. We were actually pleasantly surprised with a lot of good contributions already happening to DataHub within the short span of open sourcing, which includes like K8 support and not to discount the great design conversations and modeling prototypes and proposals. The community is already kind of driving some key aspects of the roadmap and product and helping both LinkedIn as well as everyone out there. About how we make change, like how do we deal with the conflicts, or how we are about the merges and all, like maybe March, you can give a better technical answer to that.
And I'm glad you bring this point, Tobias. It's once again, we'll probably need an entire podcast to talk about this in details, but it is by no means no jokes, right? I mean, it is not a simple task. And I know it's probably for like a new startup or a cloud native company, it seems like a very trivial thing, right? I mean, open sourcing stuff is like, let me change my private GitHub repository to public and then call that open source. But for more like sort of the more established company, big tech company, they tend to have like very, very deep integration with their in-house solutions. And, even when it comes to source code management and, CI/CD and all that sort of stuff, they're not using like what everybody else is using out there in terms of what's available. So trying to maintain that is definitely no joke. I think we actually have a blog post as well on that specifically. It's called Open Sourcing DataHub, LinkedIn's metadata search and discovery platform, and also on LinkedIn's engineering blog. So you can find the detail there. But in short, we actually have to develop custom tooling for us in order to be able to keep the two repository in sync. And so it is definitely a lot of work upfront, but it actually gives us a huge benefit in terms of being able to open source at all. Because a lot of time, if you don't develop a project as open source first, and trying to open source it at a later stage can be a very, very painful task, because you would have probably taken on a lot of internal dependencies, and then it's very hard to, unless you are very, very conscious about every single design that you put out, it wouldn't put everything behind a nice interface. But if you say, okay, we can only open source when everything is nice and clean, guess what? That would never happen, because nobody will say, that's past all the development for a quarter, 2 quarters just to do open source, right? That is not possible in reality. So the tooling that we develop sort of once again try to strike a balance, making sure that we can move very fast internally without being slowed down by open source, so to speak, because we have to do all these 9 things and whatnot. But at the same time, we can also open source our code as quickly as we can. But also on top of that, pave a pathway where we can reduce all of these non-interfaced things into nice interface, refactor them into nice interfaces over time. So the end goal is to say, whatever runs in open source should be 90% similar to whatever we run internally, and everything that's different can be easily loaded as a plugin sort of style. That is definitely the holy grail that we're moving towards. And then developing these tooling will allow us to move towards that, rather than saying that we have to move there first before we can even open source the first line of source code.
And as far as the ways that you're seeing DataHub being used inside and outside of LinkedIn, what are some of the most interesting or unexpected or innovative ways that you've seen it deployed and implemented?
Definitely a lot of interesting lessons throughout this journey. First of all, I would like to call building DataHub definitely confirmed the need for such a scalable metadata system, and also prove the point around how much synergy we can unlock across these various data systems with a connected metadata story. At the rate how the data space is really growing in terms of scale and complexity, I think we all need a well-connected metadata graph and metadata insights now more than ever before. But the challenge is the new paradigm shift in how many companies thought about metadata. This is going to take some time and effort for all of these things to converge into common path. But we are really happy to see a lot of data teams and companies already feeling the connection to this connected metadata story. What we are building towards.
And in terms of internal implementation, adoption of DataHub, like I mentioned, we were pleasantly surprised on how receptive people are saying, hey, we do want to build something from day one to sort of fit this connected story. Even though we don't know for sure that we're going to use it, but knowing that, we build it the right way. So if there's a use case we want to unlock, we can easily do that without having to re-architect the whole thing. That, appeals to a lot of people. So we have internally, we have a lot of AI infrastructure built out, sort of just, around based on the DataHub architecture. And all those rich metadata is sort of available at our fingertip if we want to get access to it. We have too much on our plate right now in terms of use cases and whatnot, but I'm pretty sure later on, someone will start asking questions and say, hey, can we leverage those metadata to do other things? And we'll be very glad to help them. Yep, we have Node already linked up. We just need to find the right query to query it, and then a right way to present the data back to them.
Just to add, I think doing this type of metadata is more like a discipline or like a culture which we should drive to reap the benefits in the long term, rather than very short use cases which we are seeing right now. So like you said, it's definitely going to take a lot more time, but it's going to benefit us all in the long term, definitely.
What are the cases when DataHub is the wrong choice and somebody would be better served just relying on maybe the Hive Metastore or some of the built-in metadata management for their database or data warehouse, or something along the lines of the Marquez project?
So I think on the technical front, right, a couple of ways, right? One is many times people confuse between data versus metadata. Just to clarify that, hey, this is purely a metadata store, and you still do need data stores whom you can contact and store your data and operate your data, right? This works in connection to those data stores. Some of these data stores are also built for very specific purposes based on the nature of the data, like an OLAP store or key value based store or a relational DB. Those things cannot be replaced, right? This metadata has to work in tandem to that. And on organizational front, this kind of a scaled metadata system or a DataHub kind of a solution really doesn't give a lot of return of investment if you don't have more than 10 people in your organization who is dealing with data. So we have found that it definitely yields a lot more benefits beyond that scale. But we have also seen a lot of startups who are planning to grow their data ecosystem coming and doing an early adoption with DataHub with an intention of having an early engagement and building that metadata discipline early into their data culture.
In other words, if you have a guy in the company or girl that you can just go to and say, hey, tell me everything about all the data assets that you have in the company and how they're related, if the person can answer that easily, then you probably don't need a catalog or the metadata system at that point.
As you continue to build out DataHub and support its use within LinkedIn and engage with the open source community, what do you have planned for the future of the project, or particular areas of contribution or feedback that you're looking for?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, it's only been 6 months. We open source DataHub, but we are really excited to see a lot of interest and early adoptions happening through our open source community. The community is definitely playing a good role in driving the roadmap and adoption, right? We conduct like monthly town halls now, and there is good participation and like very interested questions being asked and like engagement happening over Slack channels or individual session, like meeting sessions and things. With great support from LinkedIn's leadership and like collaboration with our open source partners, we are definitely working towards true democratization of data management. So we have shared our like roadmaps and stuff on the open source project as well, which speaks to the same things what I mentioned here.
Are there any other aspects of the work that you're doing on DataHub or the overall space of metadata management and data catalogs that we didn't discuss yet that you'd like to cover before we close out the show?
So I think I want to iterate that DataHub is something that we work on for the good part of the last 3.5 years. It's kind of the combination of all the learnings that we had at LinkedIn. And I think the system is the way it is today for a reason. A lot of design choices that we made, we didn't make it lightly. We made it because we need to make those choices. So on the surface, when someone look at this, they might say, hey, it looks awfully complicated, right? I mean, why do I need something like this when I can just quickly write a couple of Python script and then create a Flask app and then just run with it, right? Why do I have to go through all these trouble of being disciplined about getting the metadata in and then try to create a graph out of it and all that sort of thing? And I think the answer is very simple. Right? We've been down there, we've been through that, and we got burned pretty bad as a result of it. And then metadata is one of those strange things that it is cross-discipline and it's cross-org, it's cross-team by nature. Because without those integration, without those ingestion, the metadata itself doesn't have any value. It's when you are able to start linking them together and start keep growing it in all sorts of different dimensions, both in scales, complexities, richness, and all that, is when you are able to really truly unlock the value of metadata. And we do believe that DataHub has that capability. And we maybe a year down the track, you ask us to come back and then present our V4. Who knows? But hopefully for now, we're pretty sure that the architecture is battle proven and it's definitely good for what the foreseeable future. So that's kind of the sort of the closing thoughts I have on DataHub.
All right. Well, for anybody who wants to get in touch with you or follow along with the work that you're doing or contribute to the work that you're doing on DataHub, I'll have you add your preferred contact information to the show notes. And as a final question, I would just like to get your perspective on what you see as being the biggest gap in the tooling or technology that's available for data management today.
Yeah, thanks for asking this. Like, I think the answer to this lies in the true nature of metadata, which is really highly connected with each other, right? So most of the tools and technologies out there, what we have really focuses more on very specific use cases of metadata, like either cataloging or compliance or just lineage or access control, etc. However, we believe that like these are all different verticals built on top of a connected metadata graph, and they cannot work in silos. Our focus is really to build world-class metadata infrastructure that surfaces the metadata graph to support any of these use cases. You can view the DataHub, the web app. What we have on the surface is just the search and discovery aspect use case on top of this graph, and you can see a lot more applications like this, which can be built upon the fundamental metadata graph, which we are building underneath. That's I see is a major differentiator or the biggest gap with respect to what we have outside and what we are working towards.
I can also add a little bit more after this. So there's also one thing that we did observe in the industry is that you have sort of the two groups of metadata, quote unquote, services or application, right? One is very much geared towards operational. So like high metastore will be the typical example where it's all about operational metadata, and it's going to be used extensively in a programmatic way in production. On the other side, there's also groups of product that focus purely on search and discovery, right? Saying that, hey, they treat metadata mostly at read-only at that point, and then the consumption is all human-based. Our point here is that there shouldn't be two different systems. You should have one system that's able to support both scenario, which means the system has to be super scalable because it has and reliable because it has to support operational things. But then it should also be super flexible that you can build all sorts of fancy apps on top. Right? So we do believe that DataHub is one of the special project out there where we're trying to target both, not just one or the other.
Well, thank you both very much for taking the time today to join me and discuss the work that you've been doing with DataHub. It's definitely a very interesting project and one that I've been keeping an eye on since you first released it. And I look forward to seeing where you take it in the future. And I definitely plan on taking a closer look for my own purposes. So thank you both for all the time and effort you put into that. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, Tobias.
Thanks, Tobias.
Listening. Don't forget to check out our other show, podcast.init, at pythonpodcast.com to learn about the Python language, its community, and the innovative ways it is being used. And visit the site at dataengineeringpodcast.com to subscribe to the show, sign up for the mailing list, and read the show notes. If you've learned something or tried out a project from the show, then tell us about it. Email hosts at dataengineeringpodcast.com with your story. And to help other people find the show, please leave a review on iTunes and tell your friends and coworkers.